Varun, in the article that you wrote, you did say that when the revolution comes, as you just said, energy executives would at last rub elbows with top academics at technology conferences. Well, you're right here rubbing elbows with Derek Parkin of CLP Holdings Limited, major utility here. So the revolution is coming here to Hong Kong for you. The other thing I would point out, if I can pull this up, just last week, Hong Kong Polytechnic University successfully developed perovskite silicon tandem solar cells with the world's highest power conversion efficiency of 25.5%.
Last week?
Yes.
That's fantastic news.
Yes. So you're in the right place to be bringing us this news. And Hong Kong, in a lot of ways, is further ahead than people realize. So we're here to be part of this revolution. The other member of our panel is Justin Wu from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and my colleague Alexis Lau from the Division of Environment at HKUST. I should also mention, along with all this exciting good news, today is not only the day that world leaders will sign the Paris Agreement on climate, it's also the day that SunEdison, one of the once largest and fastest growing renewable energy companies, has filed for bankruptcy. They are the holding company for TerraPower, which Dr. Sivaram mentioned, and their stock has gone from a high of $34 a share last year to 34 cents, which raises the issue of when these investments will be safe enough for pension funds and other long-term holders. So I mention that just to dramatize the issues here. There are great breakthroughs in science, more needs to be done, but there are also real-world risks with money that has to be invested, utilities that have to make decisions, and all of us are kind of worried about when do the trade-offs move forward to where it's no longer such a cause for anxiety and we can just embrace renewable power, and what do we have to do to get there? So the panel discussion is going to bring some of these more real-world concerns and perspectives and ask how do we accelerate the progress to a secure, financially sound structure for financing progress in renewables. So I'm glad to sit down and turn things over to our panel. I'll give each of you the option of either asking a question for Dr. Sivaram or raising a point that you feel needs to be put on the table. Start with Mr. Wu.
Okay. Hello. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Just say two words about who we are and what we do. So Bloomberg New Energy Finance, as the name might not imply, is actually not a firm that's involved in financing any projects. We are a research group within Bloomberg, and our sort of research areas are about the future of energy. So we work with a lot of utilities, investors, governments, and technology companies, including many of the solar manufacturers that you heard before in the presentation, around the world on sort of what's going to happen in the future of energy. I've known Varun for actually, I think, a year and a half now, right? So we met in New York last year. So it's really good to see that you used one of our slides. Do feel free to give me a call next time. I'll send you a high resolution one before the presentation. We'll send you the soft copy as well. But one point I want to sort of just highlight, just to bring it out there, is I think you raised a very interesting point in your presentation about sort of the lock-in. But I think one thing is we do need to kind of disaggregate a bit sort of what we're talking about when we talk about technology innovation, because those are big words. They mean a lot of things, right? And there's innovation in finance, there's innovation in business models, there's innovation in the way consumers adopt to energy, and there's innovation in materials, such as the examples of thin film solar versus silicon. So one thing I will say about solar is that yes, we can, I won't sort of agree or disagree with the argument about the lock-in of silicon at the moment. But one thing that solar has done, or silicon solar has done, is yes, it's driven down the cost of solar energy. So 30 years ago it was over $1,000 a watt. Now it's less than $1 a watt for silicon module or cell. The other thing is changes the way that people use energy. Because the thing that even wind and nuclear and coal and gas all share in common is that they're large, they're centralized, You got to put them in somewhere in the middle of nowhere where there's not a lot of people there. You need to build a lot of supporting infrastructure to make sure that electricity actually reaches the people that consume it, which requires money. You need a centralized management system, which utilities and others need to do that. But solar is different, because a solar panel you can put on your rooftop. You can empower the consumer. It changes the pattern by which we consumers can use energy. So one example I'll offer is Australia. 1 out of every 7 households in Australia now has a rooftop solar panel. Okay, and that's in a country with the cheapest coal prices in the world, and that's about to export LNG. So how does that paradox fit in the fact that you have a country with abundant natural resources, cheap electricity, but everyone is putting solar panels on their rooftop? Right, so I just want to raise that as a question. I'm sure we'll come back to it, but changing patterns of consumption is something that solar has done, and I think we need to look at technology at more than just sort of, one single aspect of it, but also the way that people use it as well. Thank you.
Good morning. On one of the earlier slides, if people can think back so far, when I made my career choice many years ago, I never ticked in the box being part of a mediocre solution. I don't remember that being anywhere on my selection criteria, but and I think the comment made about industry having no idea what's happening in the solar market is, I'd just like to give people here the reassurance that that isn't the case. We are very, very close to the solar market, as we are all the renewable markets, and we work very closely with many institutions, many universities, and we're very aware of all the emerging technology. But it comes back to the reality that you speak of, that at some stage, a company like CLP, that's in a very capital-intensive industry, that has a responsibility to its shareholders, that invests huge amounts of capital, not over 5 years, over 10 years, over between 20 and 60 years for its assets in many different countries, needs a degree of stability, regulatory stability, commercial stability to encourage people to invest in those type of projects. And so the underlying problem in many cases isn't the technology itself, it isn't the innovation that doesn't work, it's how you translate that, as you say, from the lab into the field and make it a viable proposition for an organization like CLP and others to maximize that in the marketplace. So I think in many ways, and on one of the slides, it made reference to part of the energy solution being a reduction of 13% carbon via CCS. Well, there's a technology that's been around and worked commercially, but the 3 different technologies, so the capture, the transfer and the storage, equally worked in different sectors over many, many years, but it hasn't been able to be pulled together, all technologies working in unison, and to be a viable proposition. I sat on an advisory committee for the UK government over 10 years ago, and the government ministers said that we would be the leader in CCS. They've just withdrawn £2 billion British pounds of support for the CCS project. So I think many of the points that were made are absolutely right. I think we do need to invest in new technology, and to be able to support it, to get it into a stage where it can be transferred into the field. But often one of the challenges that an energy company like ours has is not the technology per se, it's the choice. We often lose sight of the fact that all of the partnerships we have with MIT, with Lausanne Polytechnique, with IMD, with Oxford, all of these partnerships, they're all coming through. We'd be inundated with technology solutions weekly. How do you select the technology of the future? How would you convince your investors that that's what the future technology, that's what we need to invest in? That's the key to the commercialization of this technology. Thank you.
Actually, I I have a background a little bit. I think a lot of people here know me did not know about. Actually, my master thesis is related to plasma physics, which is related to fusion energy. I've been working in environment for some time already, and one of the reasons I get out of plasma physics is my advisor at that point, Professor Arbon in UBC, told me, well, we've been working on fusion energy for 50 years at that time, and it was coming soon. And he said, at this point, it's still coming soon, so you better get out. But one of the points I want to talk about is, well, even if we have a technology, like if fusion happens right now, and we have really clean energy that you don't have to worry about carbon emission. From a sustainability point of view, from an impact point of view, would it actually solve our sustainability problem? I'm not so sure about that. Even if we have zero carbon energy that is free, it may actually help us resolve the climate change problem. But there's a lot of other environmental issues that if our ability to use energy increase almost without limit, our impact on other part of the environment could scale up and we could have a lot more other problem. So from an environmental point of view, I actually think that it is how we can induce people to use more reasonably, rather than just saying, okay, we can, if you want to use energy, we provide you as cheap as possible, and then we will deal with the other problem later. So I actually think that the financial solution, which say putting a tax on carbon, would be a more important way of actually incentivizing people being more rational, being more considerate in terms of the overall impact. Basically, we always talk about internalizing the external impact. And I think the technology is certainly an important solution, but we need to do the others. So that part, I want to just bring it up here.
As this is Earth Day, Alexis, it's a very good point. You do have to worry that if we can generate nearly free electricity and use that to power vehicles, that everyone will want 2 or 3 vehicles and will pave the surface of the Earth. And if we haven't put a price on wildlife and other aspects of conservation, the carbon price may not take us where we want to go. I mean, all of this is the importance of integrated systems thinking, looking at unintended consequences, and each breakthrough has to be put in context. But let me get back to something that was raised earlier and ask a question for each of our panelists. It is good to see that governments have committed to putting some funding into renewables. It's good to see that billionaires have gotten together and realized this is a global problem, and they're willing to take some long-term investments. My question is, what would be the best pathway to channel those investments? I've often wondered why utility companies were not given more public money for research, because they're where the rubber meets the road. They can tell immediately what issues are liable to give the biggest payback. But then, of course, there is the risk of lock-in to something that works now. And you have to find a balance between the basic research that can create the big breakthroughs and the applied research that puts us on a pathway toward better efficiency. So do we need a consortium of utilities and universities? Do we need separate groupings, multiple funders? If you could design a system, and again, thinking as a system, what would you advise that the government of Hong Kong or the government of the United States or the government of China start to think about?
Should I start? Okay. Sure. Good. Really interesting question. I mean, I would say that sort of, utilities are, sitting next to a utility, but I mean, right. No, I was going to say that sort of, utilities are very innovative, right, in the sense that they are actually obviously at the heart of delivering electricity to consumers, right? And if there's one sort of good that you can sell to every single person in the world, it's probably energy or electricity. You can't, there's no other good that you can probably do that with. But electricity is one of those things. I sort of talked a little bit about Australia before, but what you see sort of in developed markets now is that actually utilities are changing with the times, changing with behavior, changing with consumer behavior, right? The fact that many of the largest investors in renewable energy, and it is current technology, renewable energy, are utilities. They're the ones who are building these wind farms and solar parks. Many of them are now offering solutions to their consumers about rooftop solar or energy management solutions, bundling that with other things such as cable TV or any other storage solutions, anything else, right? Home energy management systems. Utilities are starting to offer these things, right? So you see that at the, many of them actually are at the cutting edge of doing these things, right? I know I'm sort of in a panel here that that looks at a lot at public policy, but we always sort of to take a slightly contrarian view, we always sort of believe that there is a lot of money going into renewable energy, and the market is changing. The nature of consumption of energy is already changing around us, right? So it's hard to say what is the government going to do, right? Why do we need more money from the government to put into the market? And I think it's a really valid question, right, to answer. Previously, when we were scaling up renewable energy, everybody wanted stable feed-in tariffs. Because that sort of allowed deployment of renewable energy. That gave investors a lot of certainty. But nowadays, almost every feed-in tariff system in the world is currently being dismantled right now. And we're going to competitive auctions. We're seeing solar as cheap as $50 per megawatt hour in the United Arab Emirates. We're seeing wind as cheap as $30 or $40 in parts of the US or in Brazil. All of that is done without a single dollar of government subsidy. It's done through competitive market-driven auctions. So I sort of, not to take, explicit side on the sort of the market versus government argument, because I don't really feel that way all the time. But I want to raise this question. So what is the government's role in this? Where is public money going to go?
Do you want to go next?
Sure.
I could see you were chomping at the bit.
I think I've got a mic on here.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm glad that there were a lot of disagreements. I was always told if no one disagrees with you, you haven't said anything interesting. So let me start at the beginning, and I do want to answer your question. One quick factual point. Terra Power is Bill Gates' investment. That's different from Terraform, which is SunEdison's YieldCo. SunEdison, by the way, is a great example of financial innovation gone wrong. But that's not the point I wanted to make. The point I wanted to make is that Justin's absolutely right. There's been a lot of financial and business innovation in renewable energy. And it was probably remiss of me not to bring up the broader constellation of innovation types. There's innovation in technology, but like Justin said, there's also this cool innovation that's happened, for example, in finance. In 2007, this new product called the solar lease popped up, where another company would finance your solar panel on your roof. You never paid $1 down, and your electricity bill immediately went down. That was financial innovation. This thing that SunEdison controls that didn't go so well, it was also a form of financial innovation that will put us ahead of where we used to be. However, I actually am of the opinion that in some cases, financial innovation can act as a barrier and not a bridge for technology innovation. In this particular case, it is easier to finance projects based on tried and tested technology. In fact, when the financing holds as a prerequisite that a technology has decades of data available for you to lend money, for example, at low rates, that is another way that you can screen new technologies out of the market. So I believe that there are some innovations and some progress that provides a bridge from one technology to another, and that's a good element of having an existing technology do well. But a bad element is when it raises a barrier by making, for example, financing contingent on tried and true technologies. I want to quickly address Derek's point. it may very well be the case that China Light and Power is an innovative utility at the forefront of change, and I don't mean that sarcastically. There are in fact utilities that do this. It's terrific that you guys have collaborations with MIT, for example. I was recently in Quebec, Canada. Hydro-Quebec has a gorgeous research and development facility, a big test lab where they bring in companies all over the world and have them test their technology on a test grid, a high voltage grid in the Hydro-Quebec facility. But that is a rarity. And China Light and Power, what you do may well be a rarity. Because in the United States, at least, the amount of revenue that's spent on research and development, true innovation, is less than 0.3% of sales. You take other industries that are innovative. Earlier I mentioned semiconductors. You can also look at electronics, biomedical sectors. These sectors routinely put 10 to 20% of their revenues back into research and development. So there's an order of magnitude gap between the conservative energy sector and other sectors. Now, I totally understand that some of this is very justifiable. An electricity utility needs to keep the lights on every second, 99.9% of the time. They have no room for error. And in many cases, regulators don't allow funding to be used for anything other than immediate system needs. That's short-sighted of regulators. Jack asked the question, what is a good system by which we could channel funding and possibly use utilities like yours? I didn't come up with this idea, so I don't want to mislead you, but Richard Lester at the University at MIT has a good book and a great article out last summer on a regionally focused innovation system that supports demonstration projects. His idea is that there would be some kind of surcharge on your electricity bill, and that surcharge would go to your state, and your state could contribute funds to one of several regional bodies. And those regional bodies would decide what kinds of demonstration projects to fund. That was a very complicated way of explaining it. What I wanted to say was, we absolutely need ways to take cool technologies that are in the lab, but that Derek doesn't really know if that's the right one or if it's something else. And we need to test them at scale. And we need some checks and balances to decide which ones get funded. We tried having the federal government do it, but we unfortunately had some incidents where the federal government didn't pick the best investments. Richard Lester makes the argument that regional decisions may be better for the local context. And so in the United States, at least, I think it's a great idea for regional innovation boards to provide money to test out new technologies at scale, because that's a big gap. We have some money for R&D, but we're missing money for demonstration. Final two quick points. You mentioned CCS. I do want to say the reason I know HKUST, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, is because I was reading my chemistry textbook maybe 5 years ago, and one of the molecules was called HCUST1. What is HCUST1? And I've only recently figured out that that molecule was discovered at HKUST, and that's why it's named HCUST1. And this molecule is a variant on a class of molecules that could be a very effective CCS, carbon capture and sequestration technology, a carbon capture technology, really. And so I actually don't think we're there with the technology yet. We need to scale cool molecules like this out of the lab. Final point, you made a great point that we need a carbon tax. We need a price on carbon. I think that's right. I think, again, there are two components. One is correctly pricing carbon, but the other is supporting technology. This isn't actually going to do the whole job. Now, economists might lie to you. Economists love to say, as soon as we internalize all of the externalities, we're done. But that doesn't take into account how innovation happens. As many of you may know, innovation has two causes: demand pull factors and technology push. Demand pull means you set up the market in an economic way to incentivize cool new technologies. So for example, a carbon price would make it economic to develop a cool new solar technology. But technology push is arguably more important. There have been some studies that show that technology push is even more important than demand pull. Technology push is where direct funding and support goes to the research, development, and demonstration phases. So a carbon tax, while absolutely essential, is not going to solve the whole problem.
Yes, I'll start with answering your question around your assertion that you've never understood why governments don't fund utilities directly. It's a mystery to me sometimes, but I can see the argument that certainly in a regulated environment why that is difficult for a government, because it's difficult for them to justify to the taxpayer that their money is being well spent, and that is the underlying role of the regulator, to be able to demonstrate that it's achieving the objectives that's been outlined, and taxpayers' money is going to good effect. And that's seen in reliability and safety and all of the things that we have in abundance here in Hong Kong. So I can understand that, but I'm still left with the question that if you're not careful, you create a situation whereby the incumbent acts as almost like an inertia to new technology. And that really shouldn't be the case. The incumbent should be the vehicle and the actor in bringing it to market because of the channels that it already has. And so I don't see why, in many cases, they should be in conflict. They should work in unison, almost like the technology solution that you gave, whereby the Trojan horse approach to how you bring in new technology. Because whatever the situation, because of the facts that I've outlined in terms of the long-term capital investment requirement and return, that clearly if you've got an incumbent that's got an asset that's got 40 years to pay back, then is not going to be particularly enamored by the fact that new technology is going to remove that potential to reward its investors. So how do we, I think the underlying question is, how do we get around that particular issue? How can we introduce a funding mechanism that allows an incumbent or an energy supplier to introduce technology that improves the overall position for all concerned? And so I'm fully in agreement with that. The point about carbon tax, I'm not convinced. I came from Europe. I spent many years in Europe, and I don't think you'll find many people who would say that the carbon tax has been a success for many reasons. I think the problem with carbon tax, I think in theory it's a good idea, and you can see notionally that it should drive the right behaviours, but it doesn't. There's lots of gaming that goes on, and how you administer the tax that's awarded, and whether it incentivizes the things that you think that it should incentivize is a different kettle of fish in my experience. Thank you.
Well, in terms of finance situation and relationship between government and corporate, I have very little to add. But I have one point I kind of noticed in Hong Kong, at least in the past few years, about commenting on government policy. A lot of time, I think academics has some freedom, much better, much more than a lot of other stakeholders. And I think how to encourage that collaboration, because sometimes there are controversial issues, like in particular, like Hong Kong talking about use of nuclear energy, which I think is certainly a very worthwhile thing to look at. And it may be not popular because of sentiment or because of recent event in Japan, but I think academics, the role that we have is really be able to give a more evidence-based voice to look at this type of problem. And government, because of a lot of issues right now we have, may not have the type of freedom. And corporate, they often say a lot of things that is true, but unfortunately, they may not get the same type of acceptance. So I think how to make that coordination or discussion further, we should have some type of collaboration there. How to do that more effectively, I think there's something we can try different ways out. But I definitely think there's a role for academics to be more advocating in terms of evidence rather than just saying something in terms of government.
Well, the Institute for Public Policy is all about evidence-driven discussions for the benefit of government and consumers. The choices you pointed out, I think just as there's a stream from development to demonstration, the academics, you can have 100 academic departments all working on solar cells. If one makes a breakthrough, that's great. We don't fire the other 99 because we need the competition from multiple academics to drive research forward. When you get then to the research and development stage in industry, it's okay if a lot of your efforts fail, but some of them have to succeed. Otherwise, you do close down the department. And then when you get the applications adopted by an industry, like a power utility, there's a very strong expectation that your reliability and safety has reached 100% and that all of the risk has been filtered out. Now, this makes sense in theory, but as you pointed out, right, if this means that we designate certain areas as low risk and therefore lock in our investments, and we don't have that back and forth, the interplay that you pointed out in your early graph, that this is an iterative process. You need a certain amount of risk-taking and a tolerance for trying things and failing, kind of at every stage. Maybe not the same, but you can't block it out altogether. And let me raise one last question about risk, and then we'll have the panel, and then we'll open it up to the floor. You mentioned nuclear power as an area that we have an unfortunate lock-in. I've often been puzzled that almost every technology we use after 40 or 50 years of use has gotten cheaper. This is not the case with nuclear technology. Building a nuclear plant today is far more expensive than it has ever been, even though it's using similar technology to what we've had. And the reason for that is in the finance. No one will lend money for a huge capital-intensive project unless they feel secure in that investment. They won't feel secure in a nuclear power plant unless they're following a design that has years of government approval and support behind it. Problem is, that was not a great design. And so as more and more problems come up, epicycles and additions and further safety features have to be added to that bad design, which drives up the cost and delay. Now, if, as you would tell me, if we could have a modular molten salt nuclear power facility for Hong Kong that would be cheaper, independent, reliable, could we do it? Or is there already such a mentality and lock-in that the idea of having a nuclear power facility in Hong Kong is out of the question? The idea of supporting one even in China would be dubious? Or do we just say, hey, people like solar, sunshine's good, it's friendly, we have to go around our past mistakes, we can't fix them. But boy, if that's true, your message about not making a mistake and adopting the wrong solar, right, becomes twice as powerful. So, last question, for a place like Hong Kong, for China, do we consider going back to the mix, nuclear, hydro, carbon capture, solar, or do we say, sooner or later it's going to be solar, let's try and put as many eggs in that research basket as possible? I see yes and no, so this is going to be a good debate.
I won't really comment on Hong Kong because I don't think I am really qualified to talk about sort of the situation here. But I'll say a few things about China. It's quite interesting, right? Because first of all, since it's Earth Day, let's talk a little bit about just Paris. It's great that China and the U.S. now has this climate pact, right? It's actually a really good thing. But I think one thing to take note is that actually the targets by which both China and the U.S. have in this climate pact can be easily reached. They're actually quite unambitious. If China does absolutely nothing new in terms of its policy from here until 2030, it will easily peak its emissions by about 2025. It's an unambitious target. Why is that? If you look at China, right, everybody's talked about this sort of China slowdown, and I'll come back to the energy mix question in a moment. So China actually had 0.5% electricity consumption growth in 2015. we looked at the data, we gone back, we went all the way back to 1975 and we couldn't find that a similar year with such low power consumption growth, okay? It's also the same year that China added 147 or 8 gigawatts of new power capacity, which is also the highest in history. It's also the year that China invested 110 of that $330 billion, the highest of any nation on earth in history. So it's a very interesting year where China invested the most in renewable energy, added the most wind and solar in history, added the most power capacity in history, and had the lowest electricity demand growth in its history. Well, maybe not in all of its history, but at least in modern history. I can certainly say that with confidence. So what is China's, so the question about mix, right? So again, I don't want to be the sort of the negative one on the panel, but on a panel about innovation, and I agree with the need for innovation. But if you look at how do we get there, right, with China? So about half of China's emissions is from its power sector. The other half is from its factories, right? The fact that the economy is slowing down means its emissions is going down without any carbon tax, without any major new investments or policies changing its mix. It simply is just going down by nature of the trajectory of its energy mix and the shifting of its economy. So does China need another radical new technology to generate electricity? I don't know, right? Or should it actually just enable, build market mechanisms to enable all the wind and solar that's out in Gansu and in Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia to connect to the grid so that they're not facing 30% curtailment, right? Or is it, simply that finding a way to basically shut down its subcritical coal-fired power plants around the cities to reduce air pollution, switching a lot of that to gas, which is quite cheap now, by the way. There's a lot of LNG out there now. It's very cheap. So, I'm just sort of raising this question, right? There's always this question, I think there's always this desire that something radical new, and there are those things, right? Every number of years, there is always a radical technology that changes everything. I definitely agree with that, right? So we're not, we're not in the VHS or sort of Betamax format wars, right? I'm maybe too, Baru and I may be too young to remember that in the 70s. But nowadays, we don't even have physical, we don't even use physical devices to watch our videos anymore, right? We use streaming video. So that is a technological breakthrough, right? So I'm not sort of suggesting that we won't have one in the energy space. But let's look at the next 10 or 20 years. Right? Do we need a new, radically more efficient energy generation technology in China, which cannot consume all the power it has on the ground right now? Or do we need a better market or better policies to enable and maximize what we have today?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Justin. I'm in the portfolio camp. Because not only in terms of speaking from the perspective of a utility, in terms of spreading the risk, but also in terms of the harsh realities of life. And much of what you mentioned about China's going through a huge transition. We were part of that maximum build of last year that we can't now dispatch because of the reduction in energy. But when you consider removing everything, wiping the slate clean and starting with a new model, you've got to consider the nature and the social implications of what it is that you're trying to do. In China, for instance, as you say, they've got some very inefficient old coal plants and some very inefficient factories. I'm a big believer in those areas, a transition away to more modern, more up-to-date technology is the answer. There are places whereby you could introduce the high end of innovation, but not across the piece. The other thing that you need to take into account is having spent the last several months grappling with the challenges that we face in China and India in terms of land acquisition, because solar plants take up huge tracts of land. And the local issues that you get, the local planning constraints that you get, these are all massive issues, practical issues nonetheless, that would stand in the way of being able to introduce the innovation once you got it out of the lab and you were wanting to try it out. Now, the Chinese government have made a bold step in terms of how much they're going to reduce their emissions, not just carbon, but SOx and NOx and all of the other nasties. And it is a bold. And they know the consequences that that's going to bring. They know that by moving away from coal, they're going to make over 1 million people unemployed in the coal sector. Now, that's a social issue that's going to have to be dealt with by government. And so I'm not really for the big bang in terms of replace all of that with this innovation, because that's what's going to work. And the other comment that I would make about new innovation is for the very reasons that was pointed out in the presentation. In 5 years' time, it'll be replaced by another innovation, and that may not be solar. That may be something else. It may be fusion. It may be
Probably not.
Maybe not. I lost my track there. It could be geothermal. It could be another technology. And so I'm not a big advocate of putting all the eggs in one basket, and I'm a big believer in a steady transition, moving away in the areas that we need to reduce the emissions, and in the areas where innovation is clearly a real prospect, then push hard to get the right innovation into those areas.
Believe it or not, I think Derek and I agree here. That's a first. I also very much agree with the portfolio approach. To start back on Jack's point, nuclear reactors have not decreased in cost as much as expected. By the way, they have decreased. Great paper by Jessica Lovering from the Breakthrough Institute that shows this, even though it looks like they may have increased. But they haven't done nearly as well as these other technologies, because every time you build a new nuclear plant, it's a bespoke nuclear plant. It's a brand new thing, custom built for the site. There's only one company that makes ultra heavy forgings for nuclear plants, and that's Japan Steel. There may be another one. So I absolutely think that next generation nuclear technology is going to be crucial to make nuclear a viable option. Now, I don't want to compete with Justin on talking about the Chinese market. Justin says nuclear is not necessary for the Chinese market. I'm skeptical, but so be it. I can tell you in other markets, though, for example, India, other markets in Asia, we do have tremendous load growth, and we don't have a good supply of electricity currently or even planned to meet that load growth. And you know, in one world, we'll have a lot of coal-fired power plants built in India. Over 400 are permitted. And that's a world in which India locks into a high-carbon infrastructure and may become the biggest emitter in the world by mid-century. But in another world, nuclear power is one aspect of the solution. Now, I can tell you for a fact, Jack asked, should we just put all of our eggs in the solar basket? That's a straw man, and I think you intended it that way, because solar cannot sustain an entire electricity system by itself for reasons of intermittency and other reasons. Inertia, for example. The ideal power mix in the future is still something that we have to establish, but there are various models that I trust. Some of my friends at MIT work on this, and all of their models come out with, solar in double digits, but not 100%, wind in double digits, nuclear and carbon capture and sequestration accounting for almost or more than a majority of all the power in the system. Nuclear has to be a very important part of a portfolio approach. We should not put our eggs in one basket. And I do think that for nuclear to move forward, we are going to need Generation 4 technologies. And that means considerably more investment in several different approaches, which is what China's doing. And that's why, I'm thrilled they're doing it. I wish the rest of us would follow suit.
Well, I just have a very small part to add on that, because I think no one here disagrees with the portfolio approach. But again, China, because of the recent economic expansion, they have the ability to do this. But for a lot of developing countries, how to do this transformation into better technology, how to get the international community help in terms of financing, I think that is a part that maybe the next international negotiation has to focus more. Right now, that is not seem to be being discussed a lot. And for India and for many other developing countries, I think that is the part that is really needed.
All right, let's take questions. from the floor, questions or comments? We have a microphone that will come around, so please wait for the microphone. Over there, on the other side. Good.
Thank you very much for the discussion. I want to add an additional point about the that needs to be going into the portfolio consideration. We talked, you guys talked about nuclear. You talked about CCS, which is attached to fossil fuels. I want to also bring up like the consideration besides carbon, there's also a water constraint. If we stick with thermal generation in China and India, where there's a massive water scarcity problem, we really need to have a look at innovation migrating into distributed low water intensity generation. I think that needs to be really much more discussed, and I don't think there is a real solution for that yet.
I just add a comment. You're absolutely right. I think that more and more so, utilities need to look at electrical utilities need to look in tandem with water utilities in terms of the constraints, not only in terms of emissions from the generation, but also of water usage and other impacts. I agree.
Yeah, and there's a broader point here. We don't do a good enough job of talking about the energy-water nexus. That's why I'm thrilled you brought that up. I used to work in the city of Los Angeles, in the state of California, where we use, I think the number is close to 20% of all of our energy in California is used to transport water from north to south. So, and in countries, for example, in the Middle East, creating drinkable water supplies from salt water in the ocean through desalination is an extraordinarily energy-intensive process. So there's so many of these linkages. Like you said, thermal power, especially once through cooled plants, use a ton of water. We're definitely going to have to adopt a systems approach, like Jack mentioned, an integrative systems approach, looking at the energy, water, and maybe food nexus going forward.
Thank you. In all of this, what contribution might Hong Kong make, which is both good for Hong Kong and also makes a contribution to more moving the global energy system forwards? Where do we have a sort of competitive advantage which would allow us to do something which perhaps other people would find it more difficult to do?
So I've got an idea, but I think you should take this first.
I think one of the things that that Hong Kong has to its advantage is a highly reliable infrastructure, a highly reliable generation network that's been proven over many years. And when you compare it in terms of reliability and in terms of cost across the world, it's probably one of the most reliable and one of the least expensive energy providers in the world. It has some limitations with regards to the renewable potential because of the density of housing. But that is something that could be turned around with the new technology that we've spoken of. So, for instance, if the adoption of silicon sheets could be adapted for windows, then that would put a completely different complexion on things. So in terms of what we can transport to the rest of the world, we can transport energy systems, we can transport how we've managed to create a system that is as reliable as it is that others suffer from elsewhere. In terms of innovation, clearly, I think we've got some way to go in terms of introducing full innovation into Hong Kong. And that's partly because of the regulatory regime, it has to be said, that it doesn't particularly reward for fresh trials and innovation in the way that you might see in a more liberalised market. So that would be my comment.
Sure. I'm going to be controversial here. because I read the Hong Kong sustainability plan, and I read some of the documents that China Light and Power has put together. Very impressive set of plans for Hong Kong to reduce its energy intensity even more than China will. And I think if Hong Kong does that, it will be a responsible actor, and that's great. That's not, however, what I think its opportunity for biggest impact is. Look, it's great if Hong Kong abides by what the rest of the world should do as well and reduces its own emissions, but Hong Kong's emissions are a drop in the bucket. What really matters first is if Hong Kong can create a thriving innovation ecosystem, and that's going to include places like the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, as well as if Hong Kong is able to set up incubators for companies, if it's able to attract a thriving venture capital and private equity community here. Those are ways that Hong Kong can discover things here that are scalable to the rest of the world. And the other way that Hong Kong can be very impactful, not just for its own emissions, but elsewhere, is if Hong Kong develops innovative policies and innovative financial structures that similarly can be scaled elsewhere. Again, having worked in city government, cities really we really believe in the ability of some cities to pilot an idea and rapidly scale it through the network of cities. The idea that here in China, pilot programs are so effective that some cities in China will do a pilot program, and once the national government recognizes that they've been successful, China is very effective at scaling those advances across the rest of the cities. I hope Hong Kong can take a lead in innovative climate and energy policies that will show an example for the world. That's where I think the real impact is.
My ultimate boss, Mike Bloomberg, is a UN ambassador for cities, right? So he believes that actually cities can do a lot for a lot of public policy objectives, right? Including sort of environmental objectives, solving climate change and other things. But actually, I want to sort of just say, or give a few observations, simple observations, not in my sort of role at Bloomberg Energy Finance, but actually as a resident of Hong Kong for the last 6 years. The first thing is, I certainly agree with Arun's point that the whole discussion about emissions and what Hong Kong should do to reduce its own emissions, it's good, but it is a drop in the bucket, right? The wider question is, China does a lot more, and a lot of neighboring places do a lot more. So I think it's talking about emissions is probably not the most effective way for Hong Kong. The second is, to Derek's point as well, is one observation I have is I grew up in the East Coast of the United States, and we used to have hurricanes. They came through and it knocked power out for 1 week. We still do, and they're getting worse, right? Tornadoes now too. It knocked power out for a week at our house. Luckily, the hot water is powered by gas, right? So we had hot water in the middle of the winter, but we lost electricity for a week. So my first typhoon in Hong Kong, I was quite nervous, right? Am I going to lose electricity for a week? But I followed the Hong Kong Observatory's instructions. I brought my potted plants indoors. I closed my windows and moved moved things that could break away from windows, etc. And I stayed home. Nobody panicked. And I never lost electricity, right? So I used to live in Kowloon, so that was CLP. Now I live on Hong Kong Island, so it's Hong Kong Electric, but it doesn't matter, right? The reliability is thank you very much, right? For that reliability. I don't have to worry about losing electricity for a week, right? So it's amazing, right? It's quite amazing. So, just to come back to the point, I think it's the electricity system we have works, right? It's great. I mean, as a citizen, I'll say that. So what can we do, right? So two other observations I noticed is, one is that there's a lot of buildings in Hong Kong, and there's a lot of a lot of people spend a lot of their time indoors. In the summer, it's very hot. Maybe there's something about building or home energy management that we could think about, right? So that things that so that air conditioners can shut off automatically if people are not around, so it's not freezing cold, or lights can go off and escalators can switch off. Those things are, consume a lot of electricity, right? Maybe there's something around that. And then I think the other thing is just around transportation. If we want to improve our local air quality on the roads, which are very narrow, you should think about sort of increasing the standards of the fuels and also using more electric vehicles, not just fancy Teslas, but something for the rest of us as well.
Yeah, I will say something else we haven't talked about that will contribute to the solution that also comes out of universities. I think utilities are very smart, but in a lot of respects, consumers can be less so. So we did lose a lot of electricity where I lived in Washington, D.C. suburbs, but we also had utilities that offered us very adjustable thermostats so that you could set the thermostat to operate at different intensity at different times of day, even on weekends. You could even have the utility send out an alert for expected hot weather and how much it would cost you if you kept your air conditioning on at the same level, and then you could adjust it, right? I thought it was great. I saved a lot of money. The utility abandoned it because most consumers couldn't be bothered to keep checking and adjusting their thermostat. However, if we can use artificial intelligence to play that role and sense when people are in, when they're out, what the, really, battery, energy storage, another problem. If we can use artificial intelligence partly for light and heat in buildings to sense when and how many people are there. There's even zone heating, so you can actually create cool spots or hot spots rather than heat an entire building when people are working in a particular area. So we may be able to drastically cut electricity and energy consumption in a variety of areas, in manufacturing, in residential, and as you say, it's a portfolio. Part of the portfolio is producing energy more efficiently, part of it is distributing it more efficiently, part of it is storing it more efficiently, and part of it is finding ways to use a lot less. And I think all of us think that there's progress to be made in all of these. We have time for a couple of more questions. I promised someone in back. I'm sorry, one more.
One additional point on that. Because in Hong Kong, I think we really have a very good mix of system. And the point that was just made about Hong Kong being a city as an example for other cities in China is very important. Because although a lot of us don't want to talk too much about it because we worry about people become complacent, Hong Kong's air quality have improved a lot in the past year. And actually we have the best air quality for the last 15, last year is the best air quality for the last 15 years. And a lot of the things that we can do in Hong Kong are being noticed in China, and a lot of the policy are being copied. And I really see Hong Kong will play a leading role in terms of developing a smart green city. And this is something we need to keep pushing. And I think Hong Kong has a role there in many dimensions. Power, smart grid, and all that type of thing. But if we start being complacent or we just argue among ourselves on, I would say, stupid things, then we would not be able to do that anymore. But what we have been doing for the past 10, 15 years, I think, are still leading in terms of make Hong Kong one of the most livable cities in Asia.
Gentlemen, yes.
Sorry. I wanted to take the point that you made about the carbon tax and the gaming and all of that and try and bring it all together and then ask that as a, because this is about government policy, public policy. We mentioned that carbon tax is it sounds good. In fact, it should be good, but it does get gamed. But the problem with the carbon tax is that it doesn't reflect all of the issues that we ought to be addressing. For example, we talked about smart technology. Well, then you need to use rare earths to drive this smart technology. And to get the rare earths out of China, you have huge problems with contamination of groundwater. Okay, so how we, what kind of a tool can we use to do for a total assessment of this impact on quality of life, quality of the environment, versus just a carbon tax, which is only addressing one small part of actually global warming gases. I mean, carbon, for example, if we start releasing more polychlorophins because it helps us to save carbon. Well, actually, we're just still shooting ourselves in the head. And so that's one thing I'm concerned about. And then the other thing is the gaming. I mean, we see now that we're watching the tax system, which is basically taking money and driving it to the wealthy because it's being gamed. And we mentioned the carbon tax system was being gamed. And again, that's probably taking money and driving it into certain hands. So how do we create a system where there's going to be the trust and transparency in the systems so people will believe that it's not going to be gamed and you'll get more support for it? And those are the two kind of questions I wanted to tie together.
I don't think I agree with you. This is not one of those cases where I think a systems approach beyond a price on carbon is as important as you make it out to be. By the way, thank you for the question. I do think you made some very valid points. Look, global warming is a different kind of problem than most of the other problems we face. Most of the other problems we face, and groundwater contamination is one of them, are problems where local actions cause local effects. They're problems that a government or a population has an incentive to solve because it affects them. Global warming is a prisoner's dilemma problem because there are local actions that cause global effects, and it's in every country or every locality's best interest to continue free riding on somebody else solving the problem for you. That's why it would be great if we had an all-inclusive carbon plus groundwater contamination tax, but let's solve the hardest problem. And I think the hardest problem is mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. You make a great point that there are other greenhouse gases that are not carbon dioxide, but carbon dioxide accounts for the large majority of the global warming effect. We also need to do important things, for example, on methane, on CFCs, et cetera. These are important things to do. But an effective carbon tax actually would be a tremendous boost to the world. Now, why hasn't it worked? There have been policy hiccups. For example, the price ends up being too low. But we largely understand why these hiccups happen. And I think we're in a position to learn from those issues and design a much more effective carbon tax or carbon price regime where we make sure that the price of carbon is set at a responsible level, not at the floor level that the European ETS suffered from. To sum up, systems approaches are really important. In this particular case, I think restricting the scope of the system to carbon dioxide emissions and getting toward a global price on carbon, that would be an amazing thing, and we should absolutely try and do it.
All the way in the back? I'm sorry, we don't have time for follow-up today.
Yes, in
I'm sorry, I'm
response.
in queue first. I was told I was second. Sorry, I just have to jump to lunch. Very sorry, Sylvia Chen from Empower Ventures. Thank you very much for a very exciting session today. I was first involved in a wind project, a 200 megawatt wind project in 2002, and have been looking at probably about, some of you know, 1,000 technology companies in the region in this space. I just wanted to sort of perhaps touch on a few things. Investments into tech innovations, I just perhaps wanted to draw out some of what some of the panelists have already said. We have to distinguish between energy generation technologies from energy efficiency technologies. You mentioned home management, smart grid technologies. There's a lot of innovations happening there. There's incremental technologies versus disruptive technologies. We're talking about a lot of things in one bundle there. So, and the appropriate way of thinking about these may be a bit different. Second, government's role in public policy. Again, drawing out and trying to bridge some of the points that the panelists have mentioned. There's feed-in tariffs, there's carbon tax, there's removing coal subsidies, there's surcharge of your electricity bills, which, by the way, China has been doing for a long time. Surcharging on electricity bills to pay for renewable energy technologies, R&D, actually. What you want to do depends on what you're trying to achieve. And I think, going to Justin's point about 35 minutes ago, given the cost curves of a lot of the energy generation technologies have come down a lot, we are probably going to have to de-emphasize feed-in tariffs as a policy instrument and start looking at tackling this at the consumer end and probably perhaps also at the innovation funding end. Third point, I'll be very quick because I've got to jump to lunch somewhere else. Sand Hill Road. Markets are markets, not always rational. If a technology is successful, does it necessarily lead to lock-in? I'm not always totally convinced. I think sometimes yes, sometimes no. I think, if we look at the boom and bust cycle in this space, 2006 to 2011, the really interesting question, which I'm trying to find some answers to, is why that cycle was more extreme than a lot of previous cycles and in other in other industries. Yeah, I'm trying to find the answer to that one still. Fourth, and I've only got another 45 seconds, ideal fuel mix. Just want to raise the point that no one has raised so far. It really depends also on availability of your resources. If your sun is not very good and if you have very crowded space like Hong Kong does, wind probably doesn't work as a major contribution, so it depends on the country as well. Happy to hear any counter arguments, but finally, I am very happy, Varun, you mentioned the need to support innovation in Hong Kong, one, and two, also in my sort of limited and sort of where I've been sitting for the last few years, pilots definitely need a lot of capital, and oftentimes venture capitalists like myself don't like capital-intensive stuff, and so I think both of those points, if this civic exchange and bring this to the government, that would be fabulous for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's take the last question and then have the panel reply to both at once. Could you please?
Yes, in response to that gentleman say Hong Kong is the most livable city in Asia, something like that. I think you are regarding to the air quality or clean energy, like that. But for all other situations, Hong Kong has a lot of social, political, and economic problems in Hong Kong. So it is not the most livable city in Asia. Maybe it is the most unlivable city in Asia, maybe. And second, my questions, I want to ask about how you compare in the investing in innovation in Hong Kong and compare to that of China, and how and regarding to the government's effort, something like that.
Investment? Anyone? You're already mic'd up.
Sure. So thanks so much for the comments. You asked one question there. The question was, why was the boom and bust from 2006 to 2011 particularly sharp? I think that's a great question. My theory is, in 2006, you had a bunch of factors combined. So First Solar's IPO happened, the market loved them. Al Gore released An Inconvenient Truth and won a Nobel Prize. Everybody was really excited. And venture capitalists rode this wave and decided this was the next big thing. The other reason, so that's the reason you had a boom, like a sharp boom. The reason you had a sharp drop was that the federal government followed Sand Hill Road into the clean tech sector, and everybody got burned. As you guys may remember, in 2012, the American presidential election revolved around this solar company, Solyndra. It was, the most press solar had gotten, and unfortunately, it was terrible press. And ask me about my thoughts on Solyndra later. But I think that's why the crash happened so dramatically. So dramatic boom, dramatic bust, for very idiosyncratic reasons in this time period.
I'm told that it's now time for us to clear the room. Let me ask you to thank our panel for a very entertaining and thoughtful presentation. I want to thank Civic Exchange, the Institute for Emerging Market Studies at HKUST, for joining the Institute of Public Policy and presenting this event. Particularly want to thank Varun, our main speaker, for coming from the States and getting us all thinking about the complexities of these issues. And thank you all for coming. You are absolutely right. Hong Kong has a lot of interesting and troubling issues in regard to livability and public policy. And we hope over the coming years the Institute for Public Policy may contribute something to creative solutions for those problems. So we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you all very much for coming today.